In this section, we're going to talk about how to utilize your study period to really dominate your law school finals. But here's what's going to happen. You may have followed along with this course throughout the entire semester, but when class ends, you will never be faced with as much peer pressure as when people start to study for their law school finals. People will start breaking up into their study groups, they'll start studying at home, and this is the time when all of the bad habits really come out. During this time, you want to have two main goals. Hopefully you'll have a head start on both of these goals because you will have paid attention to this course up until now. Your two goals are, of course, that you need to memorize the law and you need to learn how to apply that law in your issue spotting exams. Ideally, you have already made substantial progress on your outlines if your outlines aren't done completely. But even if not, you still have time to complete your outlines and get studying for real. But you've got to do both. You've got to memorize the law itself, and you've got to start practicing with practice tests. You've got to go on parallel tracks. You can't use the fact that you might not be done with your outline as an excuse not to practice. They are two separate skills, both of which must be mastered. And in fact, as we'll talk about in this section, one helps the other. Studying for the law helps you on your practice exams, and practice exams actually help you study the law. As I said, at this point, ideally your outline should be done. Really, if you have been putting your outline together every weekend, you should only have a week left of class notes to condense into your outline. And in fact, you really shouldn't have a very big outline at all. It should be 20 pages or less. At this point, it should be obvious. If you haven't already, you'll need to cut out all the shallow attention-grabbing things. Turn off social media, cut out web surfing, cut out TV. This is the time to do the real deep work of studying for your law school exams. The point of your outline is to put arrows in your quiver that you're going to use on the exam. By this point, you should be okay with ambiguity between the law. If there's a fork in the law where different jurisdictions use different rules, great. Be aware of that fork and be prepared to talk about those differences. If a law is ambiguous, fantastic. Be prepared to argue the ambiguity one way or another. All of this is an opportunity for points. And small things will allow you to recall the big things. So studying in general has diminishing returns, just like everything in law school. This is not a time that you want to cast aside the 80-20 principle that we talked about in Parkinson's law. This is a time to utilize it just like you would throughout the entire semester. So you want to really prioritize memorizing the type of law that's going to be utilized the most. By now, it shouldn't surprise you to learn that the type of law that's going to be most utilized on an issue spotting exam is the black letter law. And you want to spend the early part of your studying memorizing the black letter law. Whether it's an open book exam or a closed book exam, you still want to have the most utilized things memorized so that you don't have to waste time looking up the rules when you use them on an issue spotting exam. So, what you're going to do is to prioritize the black letter law of claims and defenses. What kind of claims are likely to show up on your exam? Well, if it's a torts exam, you're going to see battery, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, lots and lots of negligence. If it's a criminal law exam, you're going to see all kinds of different kinds of murder, capital murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter. You'll see battery again. All of these are claims that one person is going to use against another in your issue spotting exam. And of course, you're going to want to memorize all the defenses to those things. But at the very base, whether it's a torts exam or a contracts exam, you need to know the elements of the causes of action and know the elements of the defenses. So the very first thing you want to do in terms of studying is, I think, make flashcards for the things that are most likely to show up. Claims and their elements. That is the absolute minimum. That's what you want to have memorized as soon as possible. When you're creating these flashcards, you might want to use mnemonics. Things like graphics, silly stories that help you remember the elements or the definitions of the elements. Maybe an acronym. If you take the elements and you take the first letter of each element and create an acronym out of it. We have an innate ability to remember stories. The sillier, the better. So if you can come up with some fantastical story that weaves in the elements of a claim, great, do so. That will make it more likely that you will remember them. But whether it's flashcards or mnemonics, make sure that you're not confusing recall with recognition. Just because you are shown, say, the back of the flashcard and you remember all of the elements doesn't mean that you actually would remember all of those elements if you had to come up with it on your own. So use flashcards backwards, or don't just have a flashcard with a claim or defense on it. You might have a flashcard that has, say, on the front, element number 3 of this claim, and then it's your job to come up with what that particular element is. Do the flashcards frontwards and backwards so that you make sure you're not confusing recognition with recall. These forms of black letter law are going to form the framework that you will add all the nuances. It's much easier to remember all the nuances if you have an understanding of the black letter law down to its core. You can always add things on. And of course, you have a diminishing return. The more fundamental, or we're going to study the fundamental things first, so that we're going to add nuance later. But as we get deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, all of that information will have a diminishing return because it may or may not be one of the fundamental things that you'll talk about on an issue spotting exam. The first step is to absolutely memorize your claims and defenses and elements and definitions as early in the study period as you can. And preferably, if you've been doing your practice tests earlier in the year, you should have some foundation for memorizing your claims by this point. You should have sort of a passing understanding of what those claims are, even if you haven't memorized them word for word. That's okay. So let's talk about black letter law versus what I call gray letter law. The black letter law are the things that we want to prioritize first. A black letter law is anything that's not in dispute. It's generally the things that are at the highest level. If you remember the option tree that we talked about, well, the claim, the name of the claim is usually the first thing on the far end of the option tree. And then the elements usually form the first level of the option tree. And then sub-elements or definitions form the third level. And then sub-sub elements and additional definitions, those might form the lower level. And then one layer below that might be made up of illustrations and analogies based on the case law itself. And so as we progress from the top of the option tree down to the lower levels, well, that's when we start hitting things that are more ambiguous, that are open to interpretation. And that's okay. But if we have the solid foundation of the black letter law, and even some in between the gray letter law, then we'll have a more solid understanding of the law itself, and we'll be able to apply that on the exam. Within a particular jurisdiction, there usually isn't much dispute about the black letter law itself. Of course, different jurisdictions may disagree or have different laws, and that gives rise to forks in the law that will form an ambiguity that we will utilize, of course, on the exam and use that to spot issues. But as we progress down the option tree, the grayer the issues get. The definitions start to get more squishy. If you're talking about intent in a criminal law context, what is an intentional act? What is a knowing act? What is a reckless act? All of these things are sort of more open to interpretation, although the fact that intent can be based on something that's intentional, knowing, or reckless, that's not really open to dispute. So you might know that one of the elements, one of the branches at the top of the option tree to prove a specific crime is intent. And you might know that in the lower level, intent is made up of intentional acts, knowing acts, and reckless acts. But then when you get one level lower than that, that's when things start to get a little ambiguous. And that is the order in which we're going to study the law itself to be prepared for these issue spotting exams. A note about what I call the gray law. Lawyers have to define everything, and if there's any ambiguity, it gives discretion to judges and juries. That's okay, and in fact, it's absolutely necessary. We want judges and juries to be able to exercise some of their own discretion. There's no such thing as a legal machine that inputs facts and outputs some kind of just outcome. That's probably a good thing because it keeps lawyers employed. But apart from the black letter law, actually the vast majority of the law is made up of the gray letter law. And remember, the gray letter law is going to be anything that requires guidance and doesn't demand 100% adherence. And of course, it's a spectrum. You can have black letter law that is completely without dispute on one level, and then on the other side you have the gray law that is completely open to interpretation. Of course, when you're studying, the gray law is going to consist of sub-elements, ambiguous definitions, mid-level definitions, illustrations, which are usually based on case holdings. Sometimes there are contradictions themselves, philosophical contradictions that can give rise to gray law. Then the legal and legislative issues, and then policy arguments. All of these things are open to interpretation. As opposed to the black letter law that you might find, the classic example is a statute. The statute is written down, it is indisputable, but once you start drilling down into the elements, you start getting into the ambiguity, and that's where you get some discretion, and that's where you're going to get all of your points on your issue spotting exam. Some people at this point have a question about when they should reread their casebook and or their case notes. And the answer to that is never. You will never read your casebook again, and you will never look over your case notes again. By this point, by the time that you're studying, there is no way that you're going to be able to use case notes or case briefs. You're going to be using those 3-point definitions. You have to condense it down to be manageable to memorize this kind of law. Because cases come pre-packaged in discrete stories, you shouldn't have too much of a hard time remembering these things. If you have a solid foundation to remember that, say, one of the elements of a contract claim is that you have to show an offer and acceptance. Well, if you remember a particular case about an offer that goes wrong, the old peppercorn case from contracts, you won't have trouble remembering that. You just have to remember where in your outline that case goes, because you shouldn't have a hard time remembering these story-based legal concepts. So it's actually sort of a great thing to be able to condense cases down, because unlike your fellow law school students who may be distracted by those multi-page case briefs that they wrote when they were briefing cases, or the rainbow highlighting that they did through their casebooks, you're going to put your casebooks entirely aside so that you can focus just on that 1 or 2 line story that you told yourself, and to be able to organize that story in the form of a case in your outline where it belongs based on the rule that's being discussed. I would say in general that one of the best study tips I ever got is that any black letter law deserves its own flashcard. And any discrete element of gray letter law also probably deserves its own flashcard. So I would take any case that you have, put it on a flashcard, and make sure that you're able to remember those very easily, because that will form the meat that you put onto your skeleton of the black letter law. At this point, it should be clear that I'm a huge fan of practice tests. And the advice that I would give is that you should start doing practice tests at least halfway through the semester. Even if you don't know the substantive law yet, or it's something that won't actually be taught in the class, it's still beneficial to start doing practice tests early. And if you're listening to this lecture, during the study period or right before the study period starts, it's not too late. Just tell yourself that you must do practice tests even before you have memorized everything, even before your outline is done. Start doing practice tests. If you do a practice exam, it teaches you to push past your initial fear of not knowing the law. It forces you to get creative and to put forth a little bullshit if you have to. And this is actually a very important skill. Sometimes you will have forgotten what the black letter law is, and it's better to make it up than it is to skip over it. And I'll tell you what, when I was studying for the California bar exam, the last lecture that Barbary gives you is a lecture on bullshitting. I'm not even kidding. The last lecture they give you says that on the California exam, the California bar exam, there are 6 essays. And without fail, one of those 6 essays is on a topic that no one has studied. They do this on purpose. Because they know no one has studied this part of the exam, because no one has studied this kind of law, it forces students to make up a rule. It forces them to make up some law and apply the facts to that law. Because even the California bar exam feels like it's important to know that a lawyer can think on their feet and make something up even if they don't know. When I took the California bar exam, there was an entire essay on separation of powers. Imagine studying for the California bar exam for months, studying torts, crim law, civil procedure, even things more obscure like family law and estates and trusts. In all that time, no one spent any time on federal separation of powers. In fact, why would you even test that on a California bar exam? And they tested it specifically so that people wouldn't know what the rule was and that they would apply it to the facts of the given hypothetical. And that is an important thing to be able to do on your law school finals as well. If you can spot an issue, but you don't remember what the law is, or maybe the professor didn't even explain what that particular rule was, and yet you can kind of piece together that there are some facts that don't quite fit in with the rest of the exam. Well, that is a time to make up a rule. Maybe you want to be forthright about it and say, it's likely that there is a rule, a law that says X, Y, and Z. Under those circumstances, with the facts as given, and then go into your nitpicking analysis. That is a way to get more points than your other students. Doing practice tests early also has the effect of priming your psyche for certain fact patterns. There's only so many fact patterns out there that law professors use over and over and over again. If you do a practice exam and you see a fact pattern and you don't do very well on it, say you spend a whole hour mulling over a fact pattern and you can't figure out what causes of action are important to talk about, or you miss some issues, it's sort of psychologically scarring, but it's psychologically scarring in a good way. Anytime you ever see that fact pattern again, you will be sure to remember when you dealt with it before, and you'll be more likely to know what the rule is and what kind of application the professor is looking for when you go into your actual final. The professors are trying to use these facts against you, and if you've seen it before, you'll recognize it in the future too. It also, doing practice tests gives you a thick skin so that you can improvise on the fly. You want to get your butterflies out in a practice setting so that you don't freeze up on test day. The first time you do a practice test and you have no idea what's going on, it happens to all of us. If you can get past that, you can get past that on the real test as well. But it's a skill that must be learned, just like anything else. Others are going, of course, to be thrown for a loop. Imagine if you went into your law school finals without having done any practice tests at all. You might be freaked out. Your adrenaline is running. You might forget certain things. Anyone who has done it dozens of times before is going to be much better off than someone who's never done it before. I want to tell you a theory I have, and that's that there's no such thing as natural talent. I don't believe in natural talent. I don't think there's anyone in the entire world that can pick up a guitar without ever having played it before and start playing like Jimi Hendrix. I think almost everything that we assume is natural talent or virtuosity is a learned skill that comes from practice. If there was such a thing as true natural talent, then the sports figures that we see all over the place, they wouldn't be practicing all the time. But you know what? Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Steph Curry, they practice more than anyone else. If they truly had more natural talent than anyone else, then they wouldn't need to practice. Steph Curry is the best three-point shooter in NBA history. And yet, despite that, or maybe because of that, he still practices 500 three-point shots a day, at least. You have to learn how to take tests first, and then you have to practice them. You have about 12 weeks in a semester. Imagine if during that time you did nothing but practice three-point shots. Do you think that you could get better at three-point shots? Of course you could. Now, maybe you wouldn't be as good as Steph Curry, but you know what? During that semester, you could get better than every single one of your fellow law school students. And when you're graded on a curve, that's all that matters. You're not going to be competing against Steph Curry in a three-point shootout. You're going to be competing against your fellow law school students who may or may not know anything about issue spotting exams. And when you're graded on a curve, that's all that matters. You want to be better than everybody else so that you can get to the top of the curve. You don't have to get all the points that are available on an exam. You just have to be better than your classmates, and doing practice exams and knowing what the end goal is. That's the way to do it. Flashcards are great. And of course, I think flashcards are an absolutely essential part of the studying process. But we really learn when stakes are on the line. Think about if you've ever done a music recital. If you've ever done a music recital as a way of convincing yourself to practice, you know that knowing that you're going to be giving a public recital of your music focuses you like nothing else. It causes you to practice with an intensity that you just don't find anywhere else. If you've ever done a scrimmage in sports, you compete at a different level than if you're just practicing in general. Going through fire vulcanizes your knowledge and your skills. That is the whole point of doing practice exams. And that's why we want to take practice exams under the same conditions that we would a real law school exam itself. So, if you're not fully convinced about practice exams at this point, I want to talk about a few objections that people have. The first objection is, what if I don't know enough of the law? And I say, that's great. That is a perfect time, actually, to take practice exams. Because if you don't know the applicable law, it's a great way to learn the law itself when you review the model exam. And the fact that you're agonizing over it will prime you to learn the law in the process. So it's every practice exam is better than, I don't know, a dozen rounds with a flashcard because it provides that pressure that a scrimmage or a music recital provides. Another objection I get is, what if I don't feel ready to take a practice exam? Unfortunately, no one is ever going to feel ready. You need to get over that. You need to be willing to do what others are not willing to do. You need to take that as a sign. If you feel that way, everybody else is going to feel that way too. And you need to get over that so that you can get an advantage over everyone that listens to that little voice that says, I'm not ready yet. I'll do practice exams later once I've memorized the law. By then, it's too late. By then, you will not have spent enough time on the skills of an issue spotting exam. If you feel like you're not ready, recognize that fear and do it anyway. There's value in having to wrestle with causes of action that you don't know. There's value in having to bullshit if you have to make up a rule and apply the facts to it, even if it's not really the law. It gets you in the habit of just writing things down under pressure. There's also a way to cheat your way through a practice exam that actually has benefit itself. You can have a friend look at the model answer and extract out what law needs to be discussed in the exam. So that if, say, you and your friends reciprocate with practice exams. You look at the model answer before they answer, and then you take out all of the law and the elements and the definitions and the cases that should be discussed, take it out of the model answer, and then just give them the law so that they can look over that law for a few minutes and then dive into the exam itself. That will get you in the habit of looking for issues and writing things down without having to actually memorize the law ahead of time. That's a way that you can cheat your way through the exam. And if you reciprocate with your friends, then you're not looking at the model exam in terms of what issues they spotted before you take that exam itself. As a practitioner of law for almost 10 years, I rarely think about the most basic rules. It doesn't even occur to me to think about certain deadlines and certain rules of procedure or certain substantive areas of the law, because it's so fundamental that I'm thinking about high-level strategy down the line. And the only reason I can do that, it's not because I've studied the law for years, it's because I've practiced it. A master pianist doesn't really think about the scales of piano. They don't really think about what each key represents. They're so far beyond that they've internalized years and years of practice into their psyche. And you can do the same thing as long as you keep practicing the skills of an issue spotting exam. The fundamental aspects of certain elements of claims and certain elements of defenses, they'll become second nature to you, but it requires you to apply them. Part of being successful in law school is doing things that you're not comfortable with. If you ever feel like you're not quite comfortable yet with something, take that as a good sign. Because if you're feeling that, then everybody else would feel that way too. And you're going to be some of the few people that blow past that feeling to actually get to the hard stuff. It's so easy to just sit back. It's the reason that we create busy work for ourselves, like case briefs. It allows us to silence that worry that we have that something is hard, and so we want to avoid doing it if we can. If you're not comfortable with doing something, great, do it anyway, because not everybody is going to do it. In fact, very few people are going to go forward because they're not comfortable with it. It's important for you to take ownership and get past that. Another common objection that I get to practice exams is, what if my professor doesn't have any practice tests? I couldn't possibly use a test from a different professor. Yes, you can. And here's why. First year classes are all the same. If you put up a Venn diagram of what every single contract law class teaches and what your professor is teaching, the overlap is almost 100%. Now, sure, other classes are going to teach other facets of the substantive law, and your professor is going to talk about some marginal cases and some things that not every contracts professor talks about, but the vast majority of the subject is the same. And the worst case scenario is that you're going to learn some extra law. That's not a bad thing. In fact, if you find something on a practice test that your professor hasn't covered and isn't going to cover, well, you might be able to use that on your test. Your professor can't be sure that they didn't teach a certain aspect of the law, but they're probably going to be familiar with this extra law that you learned somewhere else. It's an opportunity to impress your professor. The bottom line is that just because your professor doesn't provide a practice test for you to use, it's no excuse. Use someone else's, come up with others, do whatever you can so that you can both practice the law and even learn some new law. Another common objection to practice exams is that the only practice exams that are available are too old. But guess what? The law doesn't change that much. And even if the law did change, so what? The hypo would still be a good test of your ability to apply the facts to the law. And if your answer happens to conflict with the model answer because the law has changed, well, so what? Then it's a good opportunity for you to recognize that. And again, use that to vulcanize the knowledge that you have. If you're able to recognize that the law has changed or that the law that is mentioned in the hypo isn't the correct law, that's great. That means you're on the right track. Just because a hypo is old does not mean that's an excuse for you not to do that practice exam. So hopefully those are some of the common objections that you might have to practice tests. Do them early and often. It's one of the best ways that you can dominate your own law school exam, is if you can do practice exams from your professor, from other schools, other professors, or you know what? Create a practice exam and give it to your friends in your study group, or have your friends come up with practice exams and give it to you. Getting in the head of the test examiner is a great way to learn the law and the kind of nuances that you've got to talk about. It's not easy to come up with a law school hypo, so putting yourself in the shoes of your professor is probably good for your ability to take those tests. So you might wonder, where can I get practice tests? Well, your school is your best source of them. For the most part, most law schools have a database of old exams that you can look at. They're almost always behind a password wall, so that they only allow current students to look at the exams. But just because your school only has so many, reach out to your friends in other law schools. Odds are, if you went to law school, some of your friends did too. They might have access to their school's practice exams, and you can make a trade with your friends. You give them so many tests and they give you so many tests. Again, it doesn't matter if the professors are different or if they covered slightly different things. The law doesn't change that much, and the law is generally taught in the same way regardless of what school you go to. There are also some resources online. The University of California at Berkeley has a big database of law school exams. They don't appear at this time to be behind a paywall or a password, so you can download a lot of those. A lot of other random law schools will allow you to see old exams. They're kind of few and far between, but they are out there. You can find them, but do what you can to find them so you have a good amount to provide practice for yourself. There is one absolute fundamental tip that I want to give you about the period between when your classes end and when you actually take your exams. And that is, do not do your outlining during the study period. If you can help it at all, get the bulk of your outlining done before you start your study period. By the time the study period comes around, your outline should be long finished, and you should be making substantial progress towards memorizing the basic law and honing your practice skills on practice exams. Now is the time to really get your practice test taking into high gear. And you can't do that if you're spending hours and hours a day on your outline. Once you have practiced under real life conditions enough, at that point, it becomes more important to outline and to see different fact patterns than it is to actually do the full-on 4-hour exam under real conditions. So here's what I would recommend. After you have done 10 practice exams under real life conditions, that means you're going to use the entire time that is allotted. You're going to write or type out your entire exam as if it was under a real life condition. You've gone through, you've plotted out how much time you're going to spend on each essay, as I recommend doing, and then you spend that much time on every essay. Or you've broken up 10 exams and just done one essay at a time. But you've done eventually the entire exam. Once you've done 10 essays, then, and only then, can you go on to a shortcut. And that shortcut is look through the exam, a new practice exam, and determine how much time you would spend outlining for that particular test. So let's say one essay question is 2 hours long. So that gives you a total of 30 minutes to outline your answer to this particular essay. Instead of taking the entire 2 hours to write out every word of the exam, just use that 30 minutes and then use logical shorthand and outline out your entire outlined response. And then stop the essay and then compare your outline to the model exam answer. What that's going to do is it will allow you to still have some of the stress of a practice exam. You're still going to be rushing for time. You're only giving yourself exactly as much time as you would allow to outline in real life conditions. What that allows you to do at that point is you can look at your outline. You can look at if you spotted all the issues, if you found the parties, you created the right conflict pairs, you listed the right elements, you found the crucial facts to support the elements and to dispute those elements, and you found all the right defenses. You can compare that to the issues that the model exam writer found. And if you missed any particular issue, you'll remember that in the future. This allows you, this system of only doing the outlining for the practice exams, it allows you to cut through 4 times as many practice exams as you would otherwise be able to do if you were doing it under actual real-life conditions where it took the full amount of time. Once you have mastered the art of writing your exam, and it takes a while, I would say it takes at least 10 full-on essays. At that point, it's more important to expose yourself to more tests, more styles, and different fact patterns than it is to hone the craft of the essay writing itself. Once you've done a sufficient number of actual essays, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20, only you'll know at that point. At that point, it's more important to focus on your issue spotting ability than it is to hone your essay writing ability. And that way you can cut through dozens, if not hundreds, of practice exams before your exams start. And imagine if you're one of the few people who has done 100 practice exams and compare that to your fellow student who's only ever done 1. I guarantee you, you will mop the floor with that person. And when you're graded on a curve, that's what's important. So don't think of the study period as a time to finish your outlines. Your outline is just a means to an end. Think of the study period as the point where you will really start to pull away from the rest of your fellow law students. It's the time when you can really hone your competitive advantage. And when you're dealing with a curve, the competitive advantage is everything you've got. It's the way that you can get on the right side of the curve instead of the left side of the curve, where you're competing for A's instead of dealing with C's. So use the study period to your advantage and start pulling away from everyone else.